Good evening, sir, and respected madam, and all my dear friends. Welcome to the webinar on expectations of Audit Committee, Chairman from Internal Audit. Today we have our guest speaker, Mr. and Venkataram. Let me give you a brief description about him. TV Venkataram is a commerce graduate from Mahatma Gandhi University, Kerala. He is a merit certificate holder and an associate member of Institute of Cost Accountants of India, a certified information system auditor, ICA USA, and also a certified Intel auditor, the IIA USA. He has attended an executive education program on leadership from Kellogg School of Management and also holds a certification on artificial intelligence from Wharton Online, Pennsylvania University. Venkat brings with him over 2 decades of experience spanning retail, service, and manufacturing sectors across diverse geographies in the domains of risk based internal audit, enterprise risk management, information security governance, and compliance. Venkat currently serves Nykaa FS and E-commerce Ventures Limited, a leading omni-channel beauty and personal care and fashion retailer in India, as senior vice president and head of internal audit and risk management. In his present role, in addition to internal audit and risk management, he holds additional portfolios of revenue assurance, operations audit, and business continuity management. Prior to joining Nykaa, Venkat had a stint with Ashok Leyland Limited as the Chief Audit Executive and Chief Risk Officer, and also with Flipkart, Aditya Birla Group, Deloitte, and Jindal. Venkat is passionate about advocacy of internal audit and risk management and contributes to the profession as a faculty on risk management for Institute of Directors and other professional bodies. In the past, he was also governing council member of RM Next, a forum of risk management professionals, and a member of board of governors of IIA Madras chapter. I hand over to Venkat to take over the webinar.
Thank you, Ms. Purvi, and thank you, Institute of Chartered Accountants of India, for giving me this opportunity. I hope I'm audible and the audio is clear.
Yes, sir.
All right. So, without let me just share the presentation so that the participants can see. I hope participants are able to see the video as well.
Yes, sir.
Thank you once again. Let me, at the outset, give a disclaimer, as is the case with the profession. The views that are contained in this session are largely mine, and I do not ascribe any of this to the institute, unless, of course, there are certain references to context with respect to the definitions and so on and so forth. But neither do they belong to the organization that I currently work for or any of the previous organizations that I have been part of. So with that, let me also outline the agenda. While the topic per se has been on the expectations from the audit committee chairman on, from the internal audit function, I think in order to get to that particular specific topic, it's also important to understand what is actually the role of audit and what do different stakeholders want from the internal audit function. And then we move on to the role of the audit committee. And last but not the least, of course, the main session being on the expectations from the audit committee chair. So I know most of you would be already aware about the definitions, but I just thought it'll be useful to give a perspective of, what does internal audit do? And as you can already see on your screen, it's assurance, to provide assurance. And what we do is to also provide objective assurance. So what does all this mean in the context of internal audit? Assurance will be largely around these streams of risk management, governance, and internal control processes, and the fact that they are operating effectively. But what is important is internal audit essays this role in an independent and objective manner. Again, coming to the specific context of what is objective assurance, what an internal audit function does or an internal auditor does is to look at evidence in an independent and unbiased manner so that he or she can provide an opinion on the particular subject matter which is being on which assurance is being provided. And as you know, assurance is typically uh, uh, three-way street where you are engaged, the internal audit function is engaged with the process owner or a specific domain head, and reports the outcomes of that particular activity into the audit committee of the board, as also to the executive leadership. So the stakeholders are two pronged. One is the immediate stakeholder is the process owner, and of course the larger stakeholders who is interested in the outcome will be the audit committee or the subset of the board, as also the executive leadership. Now, as I said, the reason why we say this is objective is that you are providing the assurance in an unbiased manner without so that the stakeholders have complete confidence in the work that you do. Obviously, an internal auditor will not have any line functional responsibility, as you know. So if an audit function holds any line function responsibility, they cannot provide an objective assurance as far as an audit of that particular function is concerned. So coming back to the topic at hand. So when we provide an assurance to the board in an objective way, they get confidence that the aspects relating to the controls or the underlying residual risks or inherent risks associated with a particular process are evaluated in a unbiased way. And moving forward, I would say that traditionally internal audit has always been looking at from a lens of value protection and preservation, which means that internal audit function looks at safeguarding of assets, compliance with the laws of the land, the policies and procedures, and primarily providing an assurance that the assets are safeguarded, which means, if I were to talk about physical assets, then the physical existence of the physical assets, from a recording point of view, the recording is complete, and the fact that there are ways and means of ensuring that the completeness and existence of the assets are captured in the financial records. For that matter, therefore, the auditor will have to ensure that there is appropriate physical observation, verification, vouching as required, and sampling as required. The primary objective, therefore, of the traditional internal audit has been to look at value preservation and protection, but also with a focus of reducing financial exposure. There is also a certain regulatory compliance that one may be required to fulfill, specifically under the CARO. And the practices of internal audit largely relied on matters, as I just touched upon, in terms of vouching and physical inspection, etc. The audit outcomes were largely captured through detailed audit reports, which offered post-mortem analysis, or rather hindsights, with respect to the area that has been covered. So the context of audit has, I would say, largely did not focus on the underlying risk, but sort of gave an assurance on the overall attributes of the area that were being covered. Moving forward, as you realize that the world has changed, and more so in the current context, we are living in a world where it's a connected world. We are in an age of information. There are adequate, or I should say, enough trust given by audit function around cybersecurity. There is also an added challenge with respect to talent scarcity, and therefore, doing more with less has been one of the focus areas of most companies. AI has taken the world by storm. So for people who have been, catching up with the technology domain, generative AI is the way to go, or has been the mantra over the last few years. And then we live in an age where social media has taken control of our lives. The way we engage with the social media is far more today as compared to what was probably 5 to 10 years ago. We have just come out of a pandemic, and very recently, of course, monkeypox is also catching everyone's attention. But although that is not a pandemic, it has assumed significant proportion to, so that people have been advised caution. But during the age of the pandemic, we all know that how work was executed remotely as well. And so even today, some of the companies engage in various business decisions in a remotely connected world. We also live in a age where geopolitics has taken center stage with respect to how businesses are conducted and how business decisions are arrived. So some of these will be the focus areas of what an enterprise risk management function would largely focus on. So in effect, we live in a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment. And I think in this context, how does internal audit play an effective role is something that we'll have to look at. As you know, the world has changed, and therefore even internal audit has to adapt itself to the new normal. And while we may be referred to as the third line of defense, I think there is a lot of fungibility with the way internal audit has performed its role and is seen more as by the business stakeholders as a and specifically the promoters or the executive leadership and by the board as a trusted advisor and not so much as only providing assurance or reports for the management to consider for action. While reports will still continue to be the bread and butter in terms of assurance reports, that is, but we do play a much more business partnering role, working very closely with the business to make sure that residual risks as identified are also mitigated. And that could be through working with the process owners on design change or also working with the technology function to make sure that adequate preventive controls are baked into the overall ecosystem within the organization. So typically, as I said some time back, with the uncertain world and a complex world that we are in, I think the focus of audit has also shifted to look at matters relating to corporate governance, enterprise risk management, strategy. Frauds, of course, is not just of a past, but even today, as there are complex business environments, frauds are also getting increasingly complex. And how do we ensure that the controls are robust enough to, if not I think prevent frauds, if not detect at some point. Of course, internal audit will also play a role through identification of lead indicators or lag indicators with respect to fraud risk as well. Cultural audit is a new domain, and I think as we speak, more and more organizations are realizing that building the right culture is probably the fabric on which an organization's success is actually built upon. So what does an internal auditor do here? Because an internal auditor's role is to improve the overall organizational governance. I think it is also important for the auditor to be not just a watchdog, but also become the eyes and ears of management and also, of course, of the board to highlight matters relating to any deficiencies in the way the company works. Specifically, culture is a combination of attitudes and behaviors. So how do we ensure that the right behaviors are resonated within the organization? So moving forward, I think the larger agenda of internal audit has to be been always to support the leadership agenda of assurance, but also become a trusted advisor, as I said, and provide adequate insights and support the value creation for the enterprise. And when we talk about value preservation and protection, we probably missing out the opportunity for value creation. And how do we do that? Right. So predominantly, when we scan the horizon, we should also be able to put our eyes and ears to the ground and understand the overall pulse of the organization and understand which are the right areas where focus has to be enabled. I mean, if I have to give you an example, assuming that there are certain new business priorities that are coming in, and the audit plan does not address those priorities for with respect to the changing business landscape, I think the internal audit plan should be flexible enough to accommodate an evaluation of the risk in the with the changes to the business. I mean, it could be the implementation of a new ERP. How does internal audit play a role with respect to evaluating the controls within the ERP ecosystem? Or it could be the fact that you have a new regulation in the horizon. How could internal audit play a role with respect to understanding what does the regulation imply for the industry or the company that you are part of? And I mean, as you know, the Digital Personal Data Protection Act has already been announced. As we look at the rules and regulations, which are a few weeks away, it is also important to understand what does the act mean for the organization and what does internal audit do with respect to sensitizing the organization about the risks associated with the new regulation and compliance matters that the organization will have to adopt to. So we can be an advisor. It need not be that we have to always essay assurance activity. We also, as you know, some of us hold multiple portfolios. Enterprise risk management is another portfolio that most internal auditors today have. And the reason that is probably vested with the internal audit function is because of the fact that internal auditors are probably the best equipped to understand the overall nuances and the interconnectedness between the different functions, including working with the stakeholders, even at the board level. So when we talk about risks, we don't necessarily have to be talking about risks at the process level, but we also need to understand how these risks can, overall impact an enterprise. And that could mean outside in risks, which could be strategic in nature, which could be geopolitical, competition, and so on and so forth. And having a 30,000 feet level appreciation of the risk, which can impact the enterprise, and also bottoms up understanding of the risk inherent within the process helps us, marry the efforts of enterprise risk management with that of the efforts of the internal audit function. And therefore, as I said, we already are, pretty much engaged in the value preservation and protection activities, but moving towards a value enhancement role the internal audit function is also moving towards a value enhancement role. How do we do that? I mean, we use technology levers. Data analytics is given these days. I don't think today any of the internal audit function does only vouching. We also, extensively adopt tools, whether ACL or IDEA or whatever. But at the end of the day, we do deploy data analytics, which helps us crunch numbers, which also helps us provide the right insights, connect the dots between multiple data sets, and then provide the right insight to the management to take decisions, right? We also participate in various surveys. I mean, I mentioned about the cultural evaluation of culture, but also it's important to understand how do we build the right ethical climate of the organization as well. These competencies of internal auditors have also undergone a change. Gone are the days when internal auditors would only be an accountant, but today I think auditors can also be economists, auditors can be engineers with a deep understanding of technology. Auditors can, of course, have a deep understanding of information security and so on and so forth. So marrying the right skill sets and building the right competencies to add value for the assurance work that you do is very critical attribute to be a successful internal auditors. Of course, there are other behavioral competencies in addition to technical competencies. Some of the behavioral competencies include the ability to influence, the ability to be assertive when required, and also the ability to negotiate and create the right messaging across the ecosystem. We've already covered the matters relating to value preservation and protection and the value creation. So let me just move on to the next one. So the expectations from the audit function have significantly arisen, and over the last decade or so, the expectations are continuously increasing. More so in a post-COVID scenario, as I said, doing more with less, stakeholder expectations have increased. But as you know, internal auditors are not Superman, but we need to be doing a role which is very close to that of a Superman, right? How do we get there? I think if you were to look at, what are the expectations of the stakeholders, we need to first understand who are our internal stakeholders and the external stakeholders, or who are the stakeholders that we engage with. For a public listed company, of course, it will be the audit committee that will be one of the primary stakeholders, but also largely because we are part of the organization, whether appointed under 138 as a completely outsourced firm, or whether in-house, or whether it's a co-source model. We do transact or we do engage with executive management. Our audit work is also largely, in terms of engagement, built very closely with the business heads and the process owners. From an external stakeholder point of view, we engage with the external auditors or the statutory auditors, as you know, and regulators on a need-to-need basis, specifically if there are instances of any matters where the regulators would be keen to understand what internal audit has done. So while I have covered the matters relating to the audit committee separately, I think here I would like to focus a bit more about the executive management and the line management. I think from an executive management point of view, they will be very keen that the internal audit focuses on the areas that are of concern to them. So, for example, in a startup company, I think one of the things that one would largely focus on is how do I ensure that there are adequate all the leakages are plugged, and how do I ensure that the issues that are identified are quickly resolved. In fact, in many a startup, one of the constant themes that one would hear is how can the internal auditor help in solving the problem and not just identifying the problem. So I think resolution of issues that are identified are very critical for from an executive management point of view. Of course, it is also important to use the right technology tools to ensure that real-time reporting of the facts are undertaken, and fraud risks or any leakages, if any, are also mitigated without delay. In fact, in some of the companies that I've been part of, I've also led the ethics. I've been the secretary to the overall ethics hotline, and in fact, what used to happen is any matters of whistleblower matters that came to attention were reviewed by the internal subcommittee, and as a secretary to the ethics committee, it was my responsibility to also ensure that the right actions are taken, whether through investigations or through the right interventions through internal reviews, etc. Right? So investigations can be either undertaken externally or through internal teams as well. So the other aspect, what executive leadership may also want is to support internal audit to support on the major projects which the company may be undertaking, or including any advisory work. So, for example, building policies or building the right. Let's say one of the policies could be the delegation of powers. Other policies could be the code of conduct, and so on and so forth. Or cross-functional projects, participation in cross-functional projects could be something that they audit. I mean, there could be an expectation from the executive management to be going beyond the role of just an internal auditor. They will also want to evaluate what does IA bring to the table. So one of the things that we regularly used to do is, every quarter we used to have interactions with the senior leadership team and highlight some of the key areas of concern or the risks that were identified by the internal audit function. As an outcome, it was also then taken on board to say what should be the necessary actions that have to be driven. And if it's a high risk, obviously the time taken to mitigate the risk should be far more leaner as compared to things that may not be of a high risk, right? So again, how do you define the risk criteria? So you work with the executive management to define the risk criteria for the organization, depending on the size and scale and maturity of the specific business vertical. From a line management point of view, I think it's also important that they would be keen to understand what are the benchmark internal audit practices that you bring, so that they see value add from the work that has been done, and they are able to probably adopt the best practices in the processes that are there. Some of the KPIs that internal audit would probably have from a line management point of view is to look at the rating of the reports. I mean, we could have a rating which talks about process maturity at an optimal level or a suboptimal level. The number of recommendations and the, of course, deeper understanding brought in by internal audit on the specific subject matter or the domain which is being audited. So I think the expectation could also be that there is a proactive way to improve the overall internal control environment. And as I said, build in the best practices for making sure that the processes are benchmarked to global standards. And from an external auditor point of view, they would be, of course, very keen to ensure that the audit coverage is adequate to ensure the requirements under the CARO, and the audit system is commensurate with the size and nature of the business. They would also want to review the overall areas within the internal audit plan. So before an audit plan is finalized for the year, as an audit function, what we typically do is engage with the statutory auditors and make sure that if they do have any specific areas of concern which has not been factored, that is also getting baked upon, right? And last but not the least, from a regulator point of view, while the interactions may be very far and few in between, I think typically if there is any specific inquiry on the organizational management, I think the regulators may review internal audit reports. I think this is as far as the stakeholders outside of the audit committee are concerned. If there are any questions so far, I'm happy to take it on board because Otherwise, this could be a monologue for some time till the end of the session. But we are in good shape. We do have a lot of time, and I'm hoping that we can keep this engagement in a much more participative mode. May I request the organizers to please come in and let me know if there are questions.
Sir, so far we have not received any questions from the participant side. But
Okay.
from my side, I have a question. Can you just elaborate on the cultural domain audit that you said about?
Yeah, so see, culture is a softer element. As you know, when we talk about within quotes tone at the top, I think quite often different companies have different cultures of operating, right? The operating styles of the in a professional management setup, the operating style may be a bit more of laissez-faire. I mean, you would be given a free hand to the audit function to do their job. I mean, and it's not just about the audit function. Everybody is treated as a professional, and therefore, there is that much more, I would say, diplomacy and tact with respect to the way decisions are taken, with respect to the way people are treated, with respect to how you engage with one another. I mean, the respect that you give to your subordinate, and therefore, the overall behaviors and the symbols within the organization are probably that much more, I should say, mature. Whereas probably in a new age company where there is so much of passion to get things done as of yesterday. I mean, people would want to solve problems and make sure that there is absolutely no space for experimenting. It is sometimes you do have a situation where it is my way or the highway sort of a culture, and I think culture is not something that is switched on at the. I mean, it's not a magic button that you just switch on. It actually shapes up over a period of time. So as a leader, one will have to be cognizant about the culture or the the overall ecosystem as to what you want to leave behind as a legacy for others to emulate, and what the organization should stand for. I mean, you have seen great places to work, and whereas some companies may not be ranked so high. So when you are talked about as a great place to work, it's a reflection of the fact that people enjoy working in that company. There is a lot of there is a healthy respect for one another, and you are not being treated unfairly. I mean, and this also means that you do have an ecosystem where there's diversity, etc. Now, coming to your point in terms of how an audit is done, I think typically culture is seen to be something that is owned only by HR, but that is really not the case. I mean, culture is also perceived by your vendors. It is also perceived by your customers. So if you are a customer of a particular chain and you end up being treated badly when you walk into the store, people don't pay attention to you, or people don't people cheat you in your transaction. I think it's all, then you start building your perception about the organization. So culture is also about what do you want your customers or your stakeholders outside your internal employees ecosystem to perceive the organization to be. And therefore, it's a very soft aspect of the organizational ecosystem. And I think from an audit point of view, one will have to look at how do you engage with not just the leadership, but also with the vendor ecosystem, the other customer ecosystem, and other parts of the organization, including the employees at the middle rung and the junior most rung. There is a saying that when people leave organizations, they leave their managers and not the organization per se. I mean, at the end of the day, why do they do that? Because it's also the tone that the manager exhibits, right? So without getting into any specific example as such, I think the audit function will, and typically it is not done by the in-house team. They typically have outside consultants. So you will have to build the confidence of the management team when this sort of a review is done. You will also have to build in the confidence from the audit committee to say that this is an area that you believe would be critical for the organizational success, actually.
Exactly, yes. So sometimes it becomes very critical because we try to create a very strong and ethical ecosystem, but the support that we prefer, that everybody will not be favorable for us at some point in time.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you, sir.
If there are no other questions, then I will move forward.
Yes, sir, you can continue.
All right. So before I move on to the audit committee's expectations and the role of the audit committee, I think to unlock the value of internal audit, I think it's important for auditors to understand what is the role that they're playing. Is it only fraud investigations, or is it something? Do they actually end up providing value for the stakeholders to appreciate the outcomes of the internal audit work undertaken? In fact, what we also do is post the audit reviews undertaken every quarter, we take feedback from the auditees to inquire with them as to whether the audit added value. And value addition is not just about telling them what has gone wrong, but also to see whether the recommendations were practical, whether the people who did the audit understood the subject domain, and so on and so forth, right? Then the other aspect is how much of the risk is actually covered by the internal audit function. So some of the companies will have a very detailed audit risk universe. And what an audit risk universe consists of is not just about the aspects relating to financial domain, but all, I mean, matters relating to financial reporting, but also look at processes beyond that. I mean, including compliance, including areas relating to cybersecurity, areas relating to the technology risk, people risk, and so on and so forth. So how much of the risk is actually covered by internal audit will also determine whether internal audit is also adding value. I mean, if you continue to focus on a given domain year after year, then internal audit typically does not add much value, except it is seen as a necessary evil for the purpose of compliance, right? We also need to understand, how have we met the expectations of the stakeholders? I mean, stakeholders, I have already outlined who are the stakeholders. So how do we measure ourselves with respect to the stakeholder expectations? Do you take feedback from the stakeholders as well? And last but not the least, I think, do we have the right tools to deliver value? Which means that are we using technology tools, whether for data analytics or for the audit tracking in terms of tracking of the audit outcomes, and to ensure that they're closed on the due dates and so on and so forth, right? So productivity tools as also data analytic tools are some of the relevant tools which help us bring in value in real-time basis. So some of the metrics I just thought it'd be useful to build. This is an illustrative example. You typically have a balanced scorecard, which can. I do refer here to the Institute of Internal Auditors professional practice framework with respect to the way metrics are designed for measuring effectiveness and efficiency of the work. We have typically most of the metrics are classified under the buckets of internal audit delivery, which is from a process point of view, the effectiveness of the delivery, and last but not the least, the capabilities of the people. The KPIs are also then mapped for the three domains, and then we do have targets. If I have to give you a slightly more granular picture, I think from a delivery point, we look at completion of the plan, the cycle time within a given number of days in terms of releasing the draft report and then obtaining the final response. From an effectiveness, making sure that the key risks are reported and they are concluded. There are regular functional updates to the executive leadership and to the audit committee. And then, of course, the tools that are used that are relevant for continuous controls monitoring, and last but not the least, functional budget. Some of these measures could also include cost savings. I have not captured cost savings here because to me, cost savings is actually an outcome of the work, and it cannot be a metric because then your focus will be diluted. And from a people point of view, the number of hours that you spend on training, and then of course you also look at the turnover of personnel. In fact, one of the metrics that I normally would look at is how are people rotated from the audit function into the business, and how do we also ensure that people are rotated from the business into the audit function, which helps us bring the right perspectives. In fact, there are companies where you have guest auditors coming in from the business into the audit function for specific audits, specifically like in areas of information security or cyber security, etc. You may want to take people from the InfoSec function as well. So then now we can move on to the provisions of Section 177 of the Act, which is the role of the Audit Committee. As you can see, the Audit Committee has multiple roles to play, not just focus on internal audit, but also to look at governance and compliance and matters relating to financial reporting, and also the external audit reports. So given that the audit committee is one of the main pillars of corporate governance, we do have Section 177 of the Companies Act 2013, which has articulated the constitution, composition, and roles and responsibilities of the audit committee. I think under 177, every listed company and certain classes of public companies must constitute an audit committee, which must have a minimum of 3 directors and with independent directors forming a majority. And I think while this is the mandate, it is also important that the chairperson, including majority of the members, have the ability to read and understand financial statements. In fact, when I look at the Sarbanes-Oxley related requirements, which was much prior, in fact, you did have, there should be a financially literate person who is chairing the chairman of the audit committee should be financially literate. In fact, what the Companies Act says is majority of the members of the audit committee, including the chairperson, must be having the ability to understand and read the financial statements. The terms of reference for the audit committee is laid on by the board of the holding company. And the terms should include the recommendation for appointment, remuneration, and terms of appointment of the auditors of the company, to review and monitor the auditor's independence and performance and effectiveness of the audit process. And here it's largely meant as independent auditors, independence and performance. Examination of the financial statement and the report of the statutory auditors, scrutiny of the intercorporate loans and investments, and approval of any related party transactions, including modification of the transaction. So every quarter, I mean, the board and the audit committee does review all of these aspects. And last but not the least, a few other things are including the valuation of assets wherever it is necessary, evaluation of the internal financial controls and risk management systems, and the funds raised through public offers and related matters relating to the use of the such funds raised. So these are all governed by the Act, and hence there is nothing that I'm adding here. Having said that, I want to focus upon the fact that the audit committee will call for comments of the statutory auditors and about the internal control systems and the observations of the statutory auditors, including the review of their financial statements before submission to the board. However, it also discusses any related issues relating to internal controls with the internal auditors as also the statutory auditors. And the audit committee will also discuss the same. If there are matters relating to internal control issues, it will also discuss the same with the management. And I will talk to you specifically in the context of internal audit in this upcoming slide. So in this particular slide, I'm just paraphrasing what is already captured under the Companies Act, right? The audit committee will have powers to investigate, authority to investigate any matter relating to it may call for investigation, and will have the power to obtain professional advice from external sources. Let's move on to the fact that they will also establish, the listed company will also establish a vigil mechanism for directors and employees to report genuine concern. So here, the vigil mechanism refers to the whistleblower hotline, and such vigil mechanism shall provide for safeguards against victimization by the whistleblower, and shall make provision for direct access to the chairman of the audit committee for inappropriate or exceptional cases. Now, in most companies, there is access of the vigil mechanism. I mean, the whistleblower hotline or the email ID is directly accessed by the chairman of the audit committee, and therefore, I think from a good practice point of view, it will be the responsibility of the audit committee chair to evaluate all such whistleblower complaints that go in through the vigil mechanism. Now, in specific context to the internal audit, I think the audit committee's tasks include reviewing the company's internal controls, and it utilizes the skills and expertise of the internal audit function, agreeing to the scope of the work, priorities, and resources. So typically, when the annual audit plan is prepared, the internal audit functions, and I'm referring to the annual internal audit coverage, the audit committee chair reviews the internal audit plan, provides his or her perspectives on such coverage. And it is also the responsibility of the audit committee to monitor the effectiveness of the internal audit function. So in effect, what this means is that whether the audit function is adequately staffed, whether the audit plan has been properly carried out, whether there are any key controls or risks that have been missed out. And I think overall it approves the internal audit charter, so when you have an internal audit charter that is being prepared, it is reviewed by the audit committee and also approved by the audit committee, right? The last aspect is with respect to the fact that the independence of the internal audit function. How does the audit committee review whether the internal audit function is performing its duties in a independent and objective manner? I think it's important, and as a good practice in one of the earlier companies that I've been part of, the audit committee chair used to receive an update from the internal audit function to say that we were free from any impairment and we did not carry any line functional responsibilities, and there has been no influence on the areas that have been audited. And I think it's a good practice to provide that disclosure upfront to the audit committee. Should there be an impairment, it is also important to highlight the same. So wherever the internal audit function carries any specific line functional responsibilities, it's important to highlight that conflict of interest or the impairment of the audit with respect to doing an audit of that particular domain to the chairman of the audit committee as well. Last but not the least, and the resourcing of the internal audit goes beyond just financial budgets, but also to make sure that we have the right skill sets to do the job, and there are people or the talent. If it is an in-house function, the talent is appropriate in both in terms of capability and capacity to fulfill the mandate of the internal audit remit, actually. Any questions so far?
No, sir.
Okay. So I think we may have about 15-20 minutes to take questions after the session, right?
Yes, sir. At the end of the session, we'll have a question and answer.
Okay. Then
for all the participants to participate. Yeah.
Excellent. So we can take the questions at that point in time. So what I've done is I've kind of carved out the different aspects of the expectations of the audit committee, and making sure that the expectations are met. So with various aspects, and we've covered most of this. I think before I get into the expectations, it's also important to note that there is a report which is shared with the internal audit output, and that is mostly every quarter as we head into an audit committee meeting, you review the outcome of the internal audit efforts with the audit committee chair. That in some companies it is done as a part of the pre-audit. In some companies it is shared prior to the audit committee meeting, and the audit committee chair may, if they have questions, come back to you for specific questions. But in most companies that I've been part of, I think the larger deliberations are held at the main audit committee meeting itself. But as we get into that subsection, I think we'll leave the questions around that later. There is also a practice in some companies to meet with a head of audit at least once a year without the presence of executive management, largely to get to know if there are issues which the internal auditor may want to bring to the audit committee chair's attention, which may not be divulged through internal audit reports. I mean, it may not have been part of the internal audit coverage, or it may have been too sensitive to be brought in as part of the reports as well. So moving on to the main topic for the day, which is respect to the expectations of the audit committee chairman from internal audit. And I think largely most of the expectations have been covered, but I would say that being the subject matter for discussion, I have carved this out from two dimensions. One is what are the KPIs, and therefore, understanding stakeholder expectations from the audit committee and the chairman of the, from the board of directors perspective. And then, of course, there are other factors as well. So some of the primary needs of the audit committee is that you have to provide an assurance as an internal auditor that key risks are being managed within the organization's stated risk appetite, which means that there is a clear and unambiguous message from the chief audit executive is expected that there are no residual risks which are exceeding the company's stated risk appetite thresholds, right? And then, of course, looking at some of the KPIs are delivery of the approved risk-based internal audit plan. So if you have planned, say, 20 or 30 audits in a given calendar year or a given financial year, the audit function has been able to deliver the same. And if they have not been able to deliver the same, then there has to be real tangible reasons as to why the internal audit coverage could not have been fully executed. To give you an example, during the COVID year, I think there were some disruptions with respect to the delivery. People were just getting adjusted to the new normal and the work from home situation. So access to data, access to resources, etc., were not perhaps possible. And so, as one worked their way in terms of managing the internal audit reviews, you also had to update the audit committee chair as to how the audit function was fulfilling its responsibilities. But predominantly in today's world now, I think post-COVID as well, you are in a position to deliver the approved internal audit plan. But more importantly, as I said, internal audit plans may not necessarily be static. They are flexible. They are, they need to be agile to meet the real demands of the organization. Then one would also need to comment upon the aging of the open issues and the residual risks. So if there are issues that have not been remediated for over a significant period of time, I think it's important for the audit committee to also know what are the issues that have not been remediated and get an update from the management as to why it has not been remediated, right? Cost savings can also be quantified. As I said some time back, this is not a metric that many companies may insist for, but there are some audit committee expectations in a few companies where cost savings will also have to be quantified and reported upon. And last but not the least, I think, 3 and 5 actually go hand in hand. I think implementation of the audit recommendations or the closure of the actions are also relevant. So if there are open issues, which is again, how many issues have actually got closed? So maybe you can report on the percentage of issues that have been closed, and for issues that have not been closed, what is it? What is the underlying reason for the change in the due date for closure? So some of the audit committees may also, while you may be seen as a business partner in-house and you may be, spending more time on advisory work or consultative work, the audit committee may not have much interest to know what is the nature of the advisory work. I mean, they may say it's a good job done, but the expectation is that the assurance is largely what they would want the internal audit function to focus upon, right? The other aspects we will cover in detail in the subsequent slides. So from a planning point of view, I think it's important that the plan is risk-based and has considered inputs from key stakeholders. So the audit committee would definitely want to know whether, you have considered all the key risks of the organization. And therefore, it is imperative that you have an audit risk universe, which you have documented, capturing by business vertical or by business process, what are the risks. And as I said, not everything can be seen only from a financial statement perspective, but you will have to understand the organizational ecosystem, which means also looking at areas which are softer in nature, such as the code of conduct and ethics, the policies and procedures of the organization, the compliance with regulations, cybersecurity related matters, and other areas specifically with respect to performance management and so on and so forth, right? So not necessarily everything is sort of baked into a financial statement, right? And then whether the plan has factored inputs from the stakeholders, given that every year the company will have a corporate planning exercise, how do you make sure that the plan is relevant and you have factored the changes to the business landscape, right? What is the materiality of the scoped in processes? I mean, if you are looking at a threshold of materiality, which is probably lower than what from a materiality point, it could be typically lower than what the statutory auditors may sort of adopt. What is the materiality threshold that internal auditors have adopted, and then what are the maturity of the processes that have been sort of factored. So if a process is given, it may be pretty high on materiality, but if the process is mature and there have been no significant audit findings for the last 2-3 years, then you may not want to do it every year. You may want to do it once in 2 years or once in 3 years, right? So you will have to look at the material residual risk arising from the prior period audits and also consider the outcomes of ERM, making sure that some of the auditable risks from ERM is also baked into the internal audit plan. And last but not the least, the audit plan has also factored inputs from the statutory auditors. I think we covered that in the previous section, but this is sort of emphasizing how the plan should be drawn up. And this is what the audit committee chair would expect, right? The second area would be from a delivery and update to the audit committee. So one of the things that the audit committee chair could expect is, do you have the right protocols for internal audit executing? Do you have the ways of working that is very clear, right from planning process to the scoping, to the audit announcements, to the conduct of meetings with the process owners, to including discussion of the draft audit reports and getting management responses, to the timelines for making sure that the responses are baked in. Also, associated risk ratings of those findings. Have you sort of socialized the risk ratings with or methodology with the stakeholders and so on and so forth? So, do you have the right ways of working for the internal audit execution? I think that's significant from an audit committee chair. They would want to know whether the audit execution process is ad hoc or is it something which has got a methodology. From a stakeholder point of view, the communication is transparent and there is no surprises. So the audit committee would also want to know how engaged are we with the stakeholder and making sure that what we report into the audit committee is not something that is a surprise to the stakeholder. So even before meeting with the audit committee chair, you have actually discussed all the issues with the process owners and the internal stakeholders before taking issues to the audit committee meetings for their understanding. Right, and then the actions for closure are clearly articulated. There are process owners. There is a clear time-bound corrective and preventive action plan. And then what gets reported to the audit committee are only significant residual risks. And at times they do insist on the fact that business stakeholders should also participate in the audit committee meeting, because it's not enough to listen to the corrective action plans from the internal auditor. They may also want the business to participate to make sure that the business owners understand the nature of the issue, the way the auditors have presented it, and also making sure that they have bought into the audit finding and the risk and the action plans as well. So in some committee meetings, I think the audit committee may not ask for detailed audit findings. What they look for is, what is the theme or what is the risk insight that the internal audit is actually presenting, and what is it that the management is taking to address the specific risk. So, just as an example, if you have covered in a manufacturing company, if there are, say, multiple units which are spread across the geographies, and assuming you're taking a subject for review as health, safety, and environment, given that manufacturing practices with respect, health and safety and environment related compliance related practices could be different across different locations. When you present the outcomes of the work that has been done, you may want to present a theme that whether the practices that have been adopted across for the company as a whole is mature, and is there a risk that needs to be sort of corrected or redressed immediately, right? I think so. These kind of insights will have to be brought in for the audit committee's attention on from a theme or an insight point of view. So moving on to the next subset, I think from an audit committee chair, the internal audit follow-up process is also relevant. One of the things that they look for is that there is a clear process to track all the significant audit findings. And, there is whatever goes into the audit report is actually captured either through a workflow mechanism or through, other mechanisms that the company may have designed. In fact, a couple of companies that I have been part of, we did design an in-house workflow solution where all audit findings were captured with the audit process owners with the due dates and the corrective action plan. So the workflow solution used to trigger alerts 15 days prior to the due date to say that these findings are falling due. What are you doing to ensure that these have been acted upon? And the actions used to be updated within the solution and with evidence for closure being uploaded into the particular solution as well. Those used to be signed off by the functional head. And then, of course, the audit function used to take a holistic view in terms of all those issues that have been closed or even partially closed, and then present a status update to the audit committee. Now, before it goes to the audit committee, there used to be internal review meetings to evaluate why certain findings have not been remediated. And before even talking about why not remediated, we would look at whether there was a process to sort of review whether the findings that have been captured as remediated are actually closed or not. So the audit function used to actually test for the closure, basis the evidence that have been provided, and do an independent check to see that the processes, I mean the process gaps have been mitigated. If it is a design issue, we would look for the policies, but if it's an operational gap issue, then we would probably test for the process once again to say that the operational deficiencies have been resolved. Coming back to the open findings, the internal management team also used to evaluate why the risks have not been fully mitigated. Now, there could be cases where the business has changed or the process has changed, and hence an earlier process no longer holds good, and a new process has been put in place. But in that case, we would also then update the audit finding accordingly. But if there has been a change in the the process owner, because of which the process could not have been fully closed, and the new process owner has not yet fully taken charge, there could be a delay in closure of the gap. So I think depending on case-to-case basis, or if there is a need for investment, I think it's also important to understand certain actions will require capital investment or a budgetary sanction. And if that sanction has not come through because of an additional outlay which has to be approved for, then I think these sort of matters are brought into the internal steering committee to then give a decision at that point in time. And then subsequently, then they are updated to the audit committee in terms of the status of closure. And reasons for non-remediation are documented and reviewed and reported to the audit committee as well. Moving forward to the internal audit metrics, I think the audit committee chair will also evaluate whether how an internal audit function has performed during the year. And these metrics could include timely completion of the audit assignments, what are the nature of the competencies of the internal audit staff, whether we have been able to track and follow up the audit issues in a timely manner. The stakeholder feedback, which I talked about some time back in terms of the audit quality questionnaire, is also collated and updated by the audit. I mean, it is reviewed by the executive leadership as also by the audit committee chair. In fact, the audit quality questionnaire will also be shared with the executive leadership as also the audit committee chair. And then this is updated for reviewing the outcomes of the effectiveness of the internal audit efforts. And last but not the least, whether we have the right technology tools to improve productivity and add value to the audit engagements. I think some of these things have been covered earlier, and I'm sure most companies, these are similar in nature. I'm sure there are companies which have probably got larger amount of matrices to report on the internal audit effectiveness, including the budgetary allocations and the utilization of the budget. Then moving forward, I think we spoke about the budgets and the key stakeholder engagement. I think staffing budgets is also budgets for usage of relevant third-party service providers, wherever you do not have the in-house capability or capacity, whether they are adequate to meet the requirements of the internal audit function. I think the audit committee does check with the head of audit as to whether the budgets are sufficient, both from people and financial outlay as well. And this is done at the beginning of the year so that we are not caught by surprise at the end of the year that we didn't have adequate financial outlay or the talent pool to meet the requirements of the delivery, right? There is also regular meetings had by the internal audit function with the executive leadership, and the audit committee chair evaluates whether such meetings go beyond the internal audit reviews. What this means is that how effective is internal audit to engage with the stakeholders? Do the internal auditors bring in their own perspectives on the business landscape and risk beyond the scope of internal audit work alone? I mean, to give you an example, if you know that the business risks relating to, I mentioned about this example some time back, the Personal Digital Protection Act, Data Protection Act. If that is known and it is not part of the audit calendar as such, but to highlight the risks associated with the non-compliance, do you engage with the CTO? Do you engage with the CISO? And do you also ensure that these matters are brought in from an insight point of view to the executive leadership. In fact, one of the good practices that we used to have in one of the early organizations is every quarter, I used to provide an independent insight on some of the key emerging risks and risks that are relevant. And this is beyond the enterprise risk management efforts. But it used to be a note to the CEO of the company and the CFO of the company, which talked about what are the insights coming in from the internal audit reviews that are done. What are the themes that are there, but also looking ahead, what are the focus areas that the management should also drive to mitigate the risk for emerging control related issues. I mean, this you can, there's something called management by walking around or audit by walking around. I think if you are in a company that operates in multiple locations, it is important that as an audit function lead, you need to engage with different strata of the organization, whether it is the middle management or the lower management, and even if you're traveling to your regional offices, etc., understand what are the key pain points there and relay it back to the executive leadership CEO, but from a thematic perspective, not necessarily from who said what. I mean, how do you harness the intelligence that you've gathered through your conversations and make sure that since you are the eyes and ears of the organization, the audit function therefore has a larger role to play. And I think this is very critical for the success of an internal audit function as well. Last but not the least, I think I've already highlighted that whether the appointed internal auditor periodically meets with the statutory auditor to deliberate matters of internal controls and outcomes of internal audit engagement. So these are some of the expectations from the stakeholder engagement and from the budget perspective as well. Going forward, I think this is the last domain that I have here. So other matters which have not been covered in the previous sections, I think there is sometimes an audit committee chair's expectations that you have also looked at the tone or the overall culture or ethical climate of the organization. You may sometimes be asked probing questions during your one-to-one engagement with the audit committee chair to say whether the management has provided the right support, whether management tone in terms of, management doesn't necessarily mean the CEO and CFO of the company. Management can also mean the executive leadership, whether they display the right behaviors for the organization to succeed. Do you sense anything amiss in your overall understanding of the ways of working of the organization? So it also depends on the audit committee chair's maturity. It also depends on the audit committee chair's own comfort with respect to the internal audit function, right? Or not only comfort, but also sometimes, their own understanding of what internal audit should do. So I think it is also therefore important. Now, I would personally want internal auditors to also sensitize the audit committee in terms of, what are the things that they have focused on beyond the internal audit engagements. And these, you may insist on having a one-to-one engagement so that if it has not been set as a precedence in the past, you could probably call for a one-to-one engagement and then convey, these sort of thoughts to the audit committee chair. It will also help them drive as I said at the beginning, audit committee is one of the key pillars of driving good governance in the company. So internal auditor has a critical role to play with respect to having these conversations with the audit committee chair as well. So I think largely I've covered all of these. In some companies, there is an inherent expectation that internal audit should have a seat at the table, primarily to know what are the changing business trajectory or what are the key business events where internal auditors should be either in a position to know about before it is too late or be part of to make sure that they are able to add value, right? So I think I have largely covered all these expectations from the audit committee chair. I might have been a bit fast in the delivery, but I would have preferred this to be a two-way communication because I think when you're doing a monologue, sometimes you do have a tendency to go a bit faster than the usual pace. So with that, I would now leave the floor open to any questions. May I request the organizers to leave the floor open for questions, if any?
We are open for all the participants to raise their questions if you have any. Sir, one of the questions that I have received is, How do you generally navigate or disconnect with the management during an internal audit, especially when the management goes on the defensive side when presented with potential improvements?
I'm sorry, I didn't follow the question. I mean, could you repeat?
Yeah, I'll repeat. How do you navigate or disconnect with the management during an internal audit, especially when the management goes on the defensive mode when presented with the potential improvements?
Yeah, I think, as I said some time back, the behavioral traits of the internal auditor is also very critical to success. Internal auditor role is not just to leave the report at the table. I mean, therefore, if, how do you influence? How do you negotiate? How do you use diplomacy and tact to convey the what is in it for them to the stakeholder is very critical. Therefore, in a position where you're discussing the internal audit findings and there is a disconnect or there is a resistance to accept the internal audit findings, I think it's important to help the business understand what is the underlying risk, what is the angle through which the finding is being presented. It is less about presenting a finding for the sake of presenting a finding. It is more about how that finding can impact the organization, whether it is a matter of compliance, whether it is a matter of efficiency, whether it's a matter of asset protection or error correction in the financial reporting or any other risk. I mean, if it's a technology risk, like for example, access rights, conflict, etc. I think the user ability to convince the user of the potential downside of that condition prevailing against the established criteria is something that it is important skill set for the auditor to convince the stakeholder. Now, it's not a you versus me sort of an approach. It is more about collaboratively how do you make sure that you are showing interest in helping the organization succeed through the assurance activity, right? Therefore, that is the reason why you would also need to use a certain amount of maturity and in terms of the way you convey the finding. One cannot become emotional when they are presenting the finding with respect to either raising the voice or shouting to say, no, this is the way we have to do it, etc., etc. I mean, so what is in it for the process owner to remediate it has to be conveyed in a very succinct way. And ultimately, as the saying goes, you can only take the horse to the water, but you cannot force it to drink. And if it does not want to drink the water, then it will die of thirst. So you'll have to convey this message in the right way that you think fit, right? But honestly, if it's a significant risk and if it is not being adopted or if it is not being accepted by the process owner, then the internal auditor has a prerogative to take it to the executive leadership. I mean, you don't start with the CEO, you start with the process owner, right? So right from the middle management to taking it to the higher level, to the taking it to the highest level. If it is a matter of significant concern, I would expect that there is a protocol with respect to the way the audit findings are communicated.
Yes, sir. Sir, you have such a vast experience. Like, if you can share some of your such incidents where you dealt with the management in a situation of dilemma.
Fortunately, I did not have too much of conflict situations arising. I think people in the organizations that I've been part of have been pretty mature with the way they have dealt with audit process. So fundamentally, I think what goes behind the scenes is also to help people understand what is internal auditor's role. You don't just walk into a discussion with the stakeholder or you don't engage with the stakeholder only when you have an audit, right? You also need to set the right context of what is the role of internal audit and help them understand how you add value. And therefore, I think the conversations with stakeholders have to be beyond the transactional relationship of an audit engagement. I think this is very critical for an internal audit function success. You have to see yourself as a business enabler and a business partner, and also showcasing that you are here to not point faults, but to improve processes. And I think if that messaging can be made consistently over a period of time and also consistently using the support of the management also wherever, I think typically in startup organizations, which are not very mature, I think it will be important to also articulate this with multiple sources to help build the right influence and messaging for the organization. So yeah, I mean, to answer your question, I have had very little situations where there was a conflict, but if it was a conflict, I think it's also important for the auditor to understand the other person's point of view. So it may not be always right for the auditor to say they are right and others are wrong, right? I mean, it's not a question of my way or the highway. So the auditors have to be receptive to listening to the other person's point of view. And if there is a clear business justification, or if there is a clear mandate which is supported by evidence, as the case may be, then I think the maturity of the auditors is also something that one will have to take into account to evaluate the circumstances and then take a view as to whether it is a one-off instance backed by credible evidence, or is it something that is a risk which needs to be reported, right? I mean, which needs to be forming part of the report. I think those kind of, I mean, that happens over a period of time. I mean, you build in your business understanding, you build in the business maturity, and your own personal maturity when you deal with such circumstances.
Exactly. Yes. True. And one more last question. Can you share or can you brief us about some of the AI tools which can help us in sharpening our audit skills, the recent ones?
Okay. Honestly, I have not used any AI tools. I do believe that IA has to surpass AI. Of course, that is on a lighter vein. But internal audit, there are definitely many tools available. We have not used it, but I think it's a matter of time with a lot of bots being designed. One can work with the tech teams, design bots to make sure that they deliver continuous controls monitoring related insights. So one doesn't have to do an audit of a control relating to, say, duplicate payments. I mean, you can develop algorithms or bots to do that continuous controls monitoring, and then report. I mean, generate the reports in such a way that the bots do an alert to the respective process owners, and it can be corrected without delay. I think depending on the maturity of the organization, depending on the maturity of the internal audit function, depending on the budgetary allocations, I think, yeah, there is definitely a lot of technology tools that the audit function can leverage, including tools to help you write reports. I mean, I'm sure there are AI-related tools which can help you design the internal audit reports. And, we live in an era where agile internal auditing is talked about. So audits which used to take 30, 40 days in the past, today can be done at the drop of a hat, within 3 to 4 days using agile audit techniques. I mean, again, agile audit techniques do not necessarily replicate an end-to-end process audit, but they will focus on key areas, which then, you take it as a sprint, you work with the process owners, make sure it is corrected. But this goes, it is outside the realm of today's discussion. I think many companies are, sort of experimenting with agile audit techniques. I think over a period of time, the days of providing, detailed audit reports with, the 5 Cs of criteria, condition, cost, consequence, and corrective action. I think those days are probably going to go into history. But we will have agile internal audits take the future, actually.
So any more questions from participants? Otherwise, we will present a vote of thanks to sir.
Looks like I have not made any impact, or there has been, one way of looking at it is nobody has understood. It's all been an overhead for them.
No, sir. Everybody has understood, I think.
Yeah, I mean, happy to take questions even offline if there is anything, but that's,
yeah,
I mean,
few of them has requested to share your presentation files if possible.
I will share it separately.
Yeah, okay, sir. Thank you. So it had been such an honor to be part of this wonderful event. On behalf of ICI, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed speaker, Venkatraman Sir TV. Thank you so much, sir. The way you explained every aspect in a very simple and lucid manner, with all the practical aspects covered therein, was really wonderful. Finally, I would also like to thank all the participants present here for making the time to be with us and making it a memorable event. Thank you, one and all present here.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thanks once again.